Hello, my name is Umesh Srinivasan from the Global Change Lab at the Center for Ecological Sciences. And what I want to give you is a flavor of the kind of work that we do looking at climate change and the loss and degradation of natural habitats and the impacts that these have on birds in the Himalayan mountain range. When it comes to climate change and habitat degradation, these are the two most important threats that biodiversity across the world is facing. And with climate change, what's been happening in tropical mountains is that species are moving upwards as temperatures rise to try and remain in the same kind of temperatures that they find suitable. Uh, so what's happening with climate change is an upward shift in the elevational ranges of species. And with habitat degradation, what happens is bird populations, for example, that lived in primary forest suddenly face degradation. And what we're trying to understand is that how does climate change and how does habitat degradation affect the behavior of birds in these tropical mountains, and we're looking at mixed species bird flocks to try and understand that, which I will talk about later, as well as we're looking at bird populations, both bird populations moving up because of climate change, as well as populations in primary forest and degraded forest, and how land degradation and climate change affects the survival of these species. So we're looking at two things, both behavior as well as population level impacts on these species. We work in the Eastern Himalayas, which is a global biodiversity hotspot. This is a map of the world color coded based on the number of bird species that you find at different locations. And the areas where you find globally the maximum species richness of birds are the Amazon basin and the Andes Mountains in South America, the Eastern Arc Mountains of Africa, and the Himalayan mountain range, within which the Eastern Himalayas is especially species rich, and we have 600 breeding bird species in the Eastern Himalayas, which is a very exciting place to work because of its high biodiversity. We use two kinds of methods to study birds in our field site. When we're studying behavior and we're looking at mixed species bird flocks, we use entirely observational techniques. So we go out into different habitats at different elevations and use binoculars and other field equipment to note down, for example, mixed species bird flock composition, what kind of species are there, and so on. And when we're tracking populations over time, what we use are mist netting and bird ringing, where we put out mist nets in the forest. Birds get caught in these mist nets. We ring them with numbered aluminum rings so that we can identify individuals. And then we release them into the habitat back to where they were caught from. And you can see here a green-tailed sunbird with a numbered ring on its leg that has been released after we banded it. So our work is entirely in the field so far, and we use both observational techniques as well as mist netting and bird ringing to study behavior and to study populations. Let's look at behavior first and mixed species bird flocks in particular. What you see on the right is a network of interactions between species that form mixed species bird flocks. So these are flocks that have multiple species in them, and they're very cohesive and very tight networks of different species. And the reason why birds form these flocks is because they can exchange benefits within these flocks. So some species are very good at increasing the amount of prey that's made available to other species in the flock. Other species are very good at warning the other participating species against predation or predators. And so both increased access to food as well as the reduced predation risk makes participating in mixed flocks very important for the survival of the bird species that participate here. And we have been monitoring mixed flocks for a few years now across an elevational gradient in the Eastern Himalayas from 800 meters at low elevations to 2,800 meters at the very high elevations, with locations in between. Um, what we see here are some preliminary results on mixed species bird flocks. Each of these points represents a mixed species bird flock depending on its composition. So two flocks over here that are very, very similar in composition, for example, they share a species, will be closer to each other in this space. Whereas two flocks that are very, very far apart, this one here and this one here, don't share any species, and therefore they're farther apart in space. And these flocks have been color coded based on the elevations on which they're found. So for example, at 800 meters on average, this ellipse represents the kind of flock composition, the kind of species that are found in these flocks. And you can see that flocks at 800 meters and 1200 meters, because they share species, have some overlap in their composition, whereas flocks at 800 meters and 2800 meters, because they don't share any species at all, they're very, very different in their composition. And what we are trying to understand is that as species move up because of climate change, what happens to these flocks? So let's say you had historically these three species participating in mixed flocks at 800 meters. These species will start moving upwards because of climate change at different rates. So species that are very thermally sensitive will move up very quickly. Species that are able to tolerate a wider range of temperatures will move up slowly or might not move up at all. So let's say you're looking at mixed flocks at 600 meters, 1600 meters, sorry, over time. Some species will be leaving 1600 meters to move even further up. Others will continue to stay. New species will start coming in from below. And what you have at any particular elevation is a reassortment of the birds that are found at that elevation. And therefore, reassortment in the kind of birds that are available to form these mixed species flocks. And what we're trying to understand is that as the bird community is reassorted on this elevational gradient, what happens to mixed species flocks? Do these interactions continue to remain the interactions that are important for the survival of the species, or do they completely break down as new species now interact with each other? So that's what we're looking at with climate change and mixed flocks. When it comes to climate change and selective logging, which is a form of habitat degradation, we've been studying over the last 9 or 10 years, uh, tracking the survival rates of bird species in primary forest and in log forest at 2000 meters in elevation. So here are our sampling plots. The green outlines represent sampling plots that are in primary forest that have not been disturbed, and the sampling plots outlined in red are logged forest plots. These are plots in which a subset of the tree species have been cut down and removed because they're commercially important, either for wood, for making furniture or fuel and so on. So there are structural changes that happen to the habitat because of this practice called selective logging. And what we're trying to understand is not just how survival rates differ between primary forest and selectively logged forest, but what happens over time in primary forest and selectively logged forest because of climate change. So to give you an example, you have two bird species here. There is a higher elevation species that has an elevational range where the 2000 meters where we are sampling is close to the lower limit of its elevational range. And we have a low elevation species here, the white-tailed robin, where the elevational range of this species is such that 2000 meters where we sample is at the upper limit of its elevational range. And as these species start moving upwards because of climate change, what we expect to see is that species moving in to 2000 meters from below should have higher and higher survival rates, because they're moving into a habitat that is more suitable for them in terms of temperature and so on. Whereas species that are leaving 2000 meters to move up even higher should show declines in elevation, in survival rates, because they're leaving a habitat that is perhaps no longer suitable for them. What we've been finding is very interesting. Let's look at the case of the white-tailed robin, which is a low elevation species that has been moving up towards 2000 meters. Over time, we're finding in primary forest, which is this green line, and over here, survival rates have been increasing as we expect. So the y-axis is survival rate, the percentage of the population that survives from 1 year to the next, and the x-axis is time. So where survival rates were very, very low, close to zero, when we started monitoring these populations in 2011-12, have now gone up to about 65% from 1 year to the next. So what we expect to see with upslope movement is what we are finding in primary forest and also in log forest, but the rate at which survival is increasing in selectively logged forest, which is represented by this brown line here, is not moving as fast, are not increasing as fast as survival rates in primary forest, which indicates that species that are moving upwards and finding log forest are perhaps not going to be able to persist because of climate change or adapt to climate change, whereas species that are moving upwards into primary forest can maintain survival rates over time. And so, these sort of results that we are getting in the lab have implications for conservation. So, for example, because species require primary forests at all elevations to be able to survive in the face of climate change, uh, we need to protect entire elevational ranges that have primary forests within them. Whereas species that are moving up into degraded landscapes like agriculture or selectively logged forests are probably not going to be able to remain resilient in the face of climate change. So the questions that we ask and the questions that we try to answer in the lab are those that have implications for policy, implications for conservation planning. So far, the bulk of our work has been in the Eastern Himalayas and the Himalayan mountain range as a whole. But in the lab, we're just interested in looking at how biodiversity responds to these various human-induced changes in the habitat. And so there is no restriction in terms of the kind of species that somebody would want to work in or the landscapes that they might want to work in, as long as the questions have some bearing or can inform conservation policy in some sense. So just to recap, we're looking at the impacts that climate change and the loss and degradation of natural habitats have on biodiversity. And if you're interested in this kind of work and the work that we're doing in the lab, please do write to me. My email address is at the bottom of the screen over there. And thank you very much for joining me, and best of luck. Thank you.